He made himself a monster on purpose, not out of madness, not out of cruelty, but because he looked forward across 10,000 years of possible futures and saw that the only way to save the human species from extinction was to become the thing they would hate enough and fear enough and eventually flee from fast enough to scatter themselves so completely across the stars that no single catastrophe, no single tyrant, no single prescient god could ever gather them all back into one place and end them. He built a prison. He was the Warden, and the escape was always the point. Let the weight of that settle for a moment. There is no urgency here. The night is already doing its slow work around you, and you can feel it. The particular quality of stillness that comes after the world outside has finally agreed to be quiet. Your breath is finding its own pace. Let it. This story will wait for you. This story has, in a sense, been waiting for 3,500 years. The room you are in right now is temporary. Every room is, every empire is, every god is. That is not a melancholy thought. It is the ground floor of the longest, strangest, most deliberate act of love in all of imagined human history. And it begins not with the God Emperor, but with his father, and with a vision his father refused to carry. Paul Atreides, the Muad'Dib, the Kwisatz Haderach, the fulfillment of a Bene Gesserit breeding program 10,000 years in the making, had seen the golden path. He had seen it the way you might see a door at the end of a very long corridor, clearly enough to know it exists, not clearly enough to know what waits behind it. What he understood was this: humanity was converging. The spice, the guild, the imperium, the great houses, all of it was pulling toward a single point, a single dependence, a fragility so complete that one targeted disruption could end the human story before it had finished its first sentence. Paul saw the answer. He saw what would be required of the person who chose to walk it, and he stepped aside. He walked into the desert instead, blinded and grieving, and left the door for someone else. That someone else was his son. Leto II. Atreides was born alongside his twin sister Ganima in the moment of their mother Chani's death. He arrived in the world already ancient, already full. The pre-born, children of a spice-saturated mother, received their ancestors' memories in the womb, and Leto had received not just the memories of the Atreides line, but the accumulated ghost parliament of 10,000 years of human minds pressing against the inside of a young skull. He was, in the most literal sense, not entirely one person. He was a vessel that had agreed to be crowded. He was also, from his earliest awareness, a prescient, not as his father was prescient. Paul's gift had been vast, but it had been a river, directional, carrying him forward whether he willed it or not. Leto's gift was different. It was not a river, it was weather. He could feel the probability of things the way you can feel a change in the air pressure before rain. He could not always see what was coming, but he could feel the shape of what would be lost if nothing changed. If you'd rather listen with your eyes already closed, find us on Spotify. The link is in the description. What he felt was an ending. Not the dramatic ending of a battle or a plague, but the quiet ending of a species that had made itself too still, too dependent, too known. Humanity had pooled into one warm basin, Arrakis and its spice at the centre of everything, and basins, if nothing disturbs them, eventually evaporate. And so Leto II made a choice that no one who loved him could fully endorse, and no one who understood him could fully condemn. He chose the golden path, not Paul's version. Paul's version required a leader, a messiah, a conqueror. Leto's version required something far more disturbing. A tyrant who lasted long enough to make tyranny itself intolerable. A god who lived long enough to make the idea of gods revolting. A peace so enforced, so suffocating, so complete, that the generation which finally shattered it would carry the shards so far and so fast that the universe itself could not contain them. He was 12 years old when he made this choice, or he was 10,000 years old depending on which way you count. Sit with that for a moment. Let it settle, the way sediment settles in water that has finally stopped being disturbed. A child with an old man's eyes and a library of ghosts behind them, standing at the threshold of a decision that would cost him his body, his humanity, his capacity for ordinary touch, and 35 centuries of ordinary life, and choosing it anyway. Not because he wanted it, but because when he looked at all the other futures they ended, and this one, the terrible one, the long and painful one, did not. The distinction between Paul and Leto is worth inhabiting slowly, because it is the emotional core of everything that follows. Paul had the vision, but he also had what the vision required him to sacrifice. He had Chani, he had love, he had the ordinary human machinery of wanting things for himself. The Golden Path asked him to give that up not as a price he would pay at the start and be done with, but as a price he would pay every day in every moment for the entirety of a reign that would outlast every human institution that existed in his time. Paul refused because he was, in the end, human enough to refuse. That humanity was not a weakness, it was the honest acknowledgement of a cost too high to pay. The tragedy of Paul Atreides is not that he failed. It is that he understood exactly what he was choosing not to do, and chose not to do it anyway, and was right to. Leto would make a different calculation. Leto would pay the price. And the first payment, the one that changed everything that followed, was not political, not military, not strategic. It was biological. It was the moment he walked into the desert alone and lay down in the sand and let the sandtrout come. What makes this act of civilization-scale strategy so unlike anything in recorded human thinking is not its ambition. Ambition at that scale has existed in other stories, other rulers, other philosophies of history. It is the inversion at its heart. Every tyrant who has ever extended their control across generations has done so to preserve power. Leto extended his control across generations to eliminate it. He was building a civilization the way an engineer builds a controlled demolition, with great care for where the pieces will fall and with the full knowledge that the falling is the purpose. To understand what that required of him, you have to hold two things simultaneously. The first, he was not wrong. Looking across the probability fields of human future, the evidence he was reading was real. The convergence was real. The fragility was real. The potential ending was not a paranoid projection, but a genuinely visible statistical tendency in the behavior of a species that had concentrated its survival on a single substance, on a single planet, in a single political structure that was showing every sign of collapsing into exactly the kind of consolidated control that could, with one catastrophic decision, end everything. He was not catastrophizing, he was diagnosing. The second thing, the people who lived through his reign did not have access to his diagnosis. They had only the experience of the cage, and the experience of a cage is the experience of a cage regardless of whether the person who built it intended eventually to open it. That gap between his intention and their experience is the moral weight of the story, and Leto never minimized it. He carried it the way he carried the ancestor voices, always present, always accounted for, never resolved. The people who had the most difficult time with this answer were the Bene Gesserit. They had been the architects of the breeding program that had produced Paul and, through Paul, Leto. They had spent 10,000 years working toward a Kwisatz Haderach, a shortcut through space, a being who could see across the full spectrum of genetic memory, and they had gotten one. They had then lost control of him when Paul refused to become their instrument, and they had watched, with the particular discomfort of people who have been outmaneuvered by their own creation, as Leto took the project they had initiated and completed it in a direction they could not have predicted and could not now influence. The Bene Gesserit's relationship to Leto across his reign was an exercise in maintained relevance. They were not powerful enough to oppose him. They were useful enough that he chose not to simply remove them from the board. They occupied a position that the ancestor voices in him recognized well. The position of an institution that has outlived the conditions that made it necessary but has not yet produced the self-awareness to dissolve gracefully. He kept them. He used them when their specific competencies were useful. He watched them, always, with the attention of someone who knows that the most dangerous move available to a cornered institution is to decide that it has a destiny. Paul's ghost was present in everything Leto did, not as a haunting but as a reference point. The way a compass needle pointing north is a reference point for someone walking in a different direction entirely. Paul had been the first to see the path. Paul had been the one who understood what it meant, not abstractly, not as a philosophical exercise, but in the specific concrete terms of what it would cost a person, day by day, to walk it. His choice not to walk it was not cowardice. It was the honest acknowledgement of a truth that Leto would spend 35 centuries living, that the person the Golden Path required was not someone who wanted to walk it. Wanting it was, in a sense, a disqualification. The path required someone who understood fully why it was terrible and chose it anyway, from the cold, clear side of full comprehension. Leto understood this about himself. He had chosen the path not because it promised him anything, not peace, not happiness, not ordinary human fullness, but because when he looked at the alternatives, they ended in ways he could not accept. The decision was made from a position of radical clarity rather than hope, and there is something in that, something in the choice made without the comfort of self-deception, that carries a weight that no more conventional form of heroism quite replicates. The desert was waiting, the sandtrout were in it, and the thing that Leto was about to become was already taking its first breath on the other side of a threshold that had no door, only the moment and the choice and the slow, irreversible arrival of what came after. The earliest records of what would become Leto's thinking on the Golden Path, preserved in the Bene Gesserit archives through channels they did not entirely control and could not entirely read, show a mind working at a problem from the inside out. He was not inheriting a solution and implementing it. He was inheriting a vision that had no implementation, because the only being who could implement it was also the only being who could understand the cost, and the only being who could understand the cost was also the only being who could choose, in full understanding, to pay it. The circularity was not a logical trap. It was a design feature. The Golden Path could only be walked by the person who had seen what was at the end of it clearly enough to choose it anyway. There is a parallel here to something the Bene Gesserit had encountered in their own tradition, and that the Zen-Sunni wanderers who had given the Freemen their philosophical heritage had also encountered: the problem of the initiated act. Certain things can only be done from within the full knowledge of what they are, and that knowledge can only be fully arrived at by doing them. The first step is taken on incomplete information, because complete information requires having already taken it. Most traditions that grapple with this problem, most spiritual and philosophical frameworks that have looked honestly at the structure of transformative commitment, arrive at the same uncomfortable conclusion. At a certain threshold of difficulty and consequence, preparation is not possible. There is only the moment of choice and what the choice makes of you afterward. Leto had prepared as fully as any being could prepare. He had the ancestor voices, he had the prescience, he had, through both of these, access to more information about what he was committing to than any being in human history had ever had access to at the moment of a major commitment. And even with all of that, the choosing was its own thing, irreducible, untransferable, his alone. The preparation had made him capable of the choice. It had not made the choice for him, and in that gap between preparation and choice, in that moment that even a prescient being could not look through without looking at it from the other side, was everything that made Leto something other than a machine executing a program. Your body is heavier than it was a moment ago. That is not an accident. That is your nervous system remembering that it has been carrying you all day and is finally being given permission to set you down. Let the surface beneath you hold you completely. You do not have to hold yourself. Not right now, not in this quiet. What we are about to enter is a story about a body that was given away, not taken, not lost, given deliberately to something older and stranger than the person who had occupied it, and the result was neither fully human nor fully creature, but something that sat in between, ruling the world from inside a skin that was no longer entirely skin. The sandtrout were the juvenile stage of the sandworm, the makers, the great Shai-Hulud of Arrakis. They were small, flat, translucent creatures that encased moisture in the desert, trapping it, sequestering it, turning wet things into dry things so that the deeper layers of the planet could remain the precise environment the worm required. They were not intelligent in any way that would comfort you. They were not companions. They were biological machinery, ancient and indifferent, doing the work of geological time, and Leto called them to him, in the desert, alone, without witness. He lay in the sand and let them come, and they came, drawn perhaps by the spice saturation in his cells, perhaps by something stranger that the worms had always been able to sense in the Atreides line. They came and they began their work. They encased his hands first, then his arms, then gradually, inevitably, they spread across his torso, his legs, his chest, a living membrane adhering to his skin, merging with it, beginning the slow process of becoming something that was neither host nor parasite, but a new category entirely. If you'd rather listen with your eyes already closed, find us on Spotify. The link is in the description. In the years that followed, Leto would describe the sensation rarely, and always obliquely. Not because it had been painful in any way a word like pain could contain, but because the vocabulary for what happened did not exist in any language the people he was speaking to had ever used. The sandtrout did not hurt him. They did something more permanent than hurt. They changed the nature of what he was experiencing the world as. His skin, what remained of his skin beneath the membrane, became capable of sensing things it could not sense before. The faint electrical signatures of moisture moving through stone, the pressure differential of a coming storm from hundreds of kilometers away, the chemistry of fear in the air around another person before that person had consciously felt afraid. In exchange, and this is the part that matters, the part that makes this covenant so enormous, he lost the ability to be touched in the ordinary way. The membrane was not painful to feel. It was not unpleasant, but it was always there, between him and every hand that reached for him, between him and the warmth of another body, between him and the texture of cloth or water or sand or the ordinary thousand small sensations that make up what we mean when we say we are inhabiting a life. To understand what this cost, you have to understand what Leto valued. He was not a man who had discarded human feeling in order to take the long view. He was, by every account in his own words and in the memories he carried, a person of overwhelming emotional capacity. He felt things with a depth that most people could not approach. He loved his sister Ganima with a completeness that had no parallel. They had shared the womb, shared the voices, shared the peculiar doubled consciousness of the preborn. He loved the memory of his father with a grief that never simplified into mythology, the way grief usually does when the person becomes a legend. He loved the idea of human beings, messy, contradictory, impermanent human beings, with a tenderness that made his chosen role all the more bewildering to those who observed him. He gave up ordinary touch. He gave it up knowing exactly what he was giving up. He gave it up for 3,500 years. The sandtrout membrane did not complete its transformation immediately. It was a slow process, a decades-long renegotiation between what Leto had been and what Leto was becoming. His legs fused gradually, taking on the muscular, segmented quality of a worm's body. His skin darkened and thickened. His eyes changed. The deep blue of spice addiction became something more, something that held light differently, that seemed to look at you and through you simultaneously. He grew stronger than any human being had ever been, strong enough to bend durasteel, to survive environments that would kill an unprotected person in seconds. He also grew slower, not in mind. His mind accelerated as the transformation progressed, the ancestor voices clarifying rather than clouding, as the spice in his tissues reached concentrations that no ordinary body could have contained. But in his physical presence in the world he became deliberate, considered, a being whose rate of moving through space had decoupled entirely from the impatience that governs most physical action. And underneath everything, underneath the governance, the philosophy, the long calculations, there was something else. The worms dreamed, and Leto increasingly dreamed with them. Not sleep dreams, not the fragmented image storms of ordinary human sleep. Something slower and more continuous. The geological patience of creatures who experienced time in deep rhythms, who had been doing the same work for millions of years before the first human stood upright, who would be doing it for millions more. Being partially worm meant having access to that patience. It meant knowing, in your cells rather than your mind, that 10 years was a very small thing, that a century was a moderate thing, that a millennium was the span in which interesting developments might begin to emerge. Was he still human? This question was asked of Leto many times across his long reign, by ambassadors and philosophers and enemies, and the people who genuinely wished to understand him. His answers varied. Sometimes he said yes, emphatically. He was more human than any single human could ever be, carrying as he did the accumulated memory of the species. Sometimes he said the question was wrongly formed. Humanity was not a category with fixed borders, but a process, a direction of travel, and he was still travelling in it. Sometimes he said nothing, and let the question hang in the silence of the room, and after a long while the person asking it would realise that the silence was the answer. What is certain is this: whatever he was, he endured. And what he endured across 35 centuries of endurance was not primarily the physical discomfort of his altered form, not the isolation of his untouchable skin. What he endured was boredom, the specific, crushing, philosophically complex boredom of a mind like his, governing a civilization he was deliberately holding still. The question of what the Sandtrout intended, if intention is even the right frame for creatures operating on biological imperatives rather than conscious choice, occupied Leto's thinking in the first decades after the merging in a way that gradually resolved itself into something that was not an answer but a useful reframing. The Sandtrout did not intend anything in the way a person intends things. They were responding to chemistry, to the specific molecular signature of his cells, to conditions they had been responding to for millions of years before any being in the universe could have articulated a question about their behavior. Their merger with him was not a negotiation. It was a biological event that he had placed himself in the path of, the way you might place yourself in the path of a current, not controlling it, but choosing to be in it, and allowing what being in it would make of you. The philosophical tradition that Leto had inherited through his Atreides lineage, and through the Bene Gesserit voices in his memory, and through the accumulated thinking of 10,000 years of human intellectual effort, had several frameworks for thinking about this kind of transformation. Most of them were inadequate. They tended to treat the body and the mind as either unified or in conflict, as either the vehicle of the self or its prison. The Sandtrout integration was neither of these things. It was more like the relationship between an instrument and the music played through it. The instrument shapes the music. The music is only possible because of the specific qualities of the instrument, and the result belongs to neither entirely but to the relationship between them. Leto found this framing, over time, more useful than any of the alternatives. He was not a man trapped in a monster's body. He was not a monster who had once been a man. He was the specific, unprecedented thing that the relationship between the two had produced. And that thing had its own nature, its own experience, its own relationship to time and sensation and the world, which was worth understanding on its own terms rather than always measuring against the human baseline it had departed from. The worm dreams deepened over the centuries. In the early decades of the merging, they had been occasional intrusions, moments when the non-human awareness at the base of his experience would surface in a particularly strong current, and he would lose, briefly, the thread of whatever human calculation he had been following. He learned to move with these moments rather than against them. He learned to let the worm patience flow through his thinking without displacing it, the way deep water can be felt underneath shallow water without making the surface turbulent. By the 2nd century of his reign, the integration had settled into something stable. 2 modes of awareness, each present, each doing its own work, neither subordinating the other. The specific sensory vocabulary that developed in Leto's body over the centuries of integration was, he noted in the journals, one of the more unexpected gifts of the transformation. He had not anticipated becoming more sensitive. He had assumed that the membrane would reduce sensation, filter it, create distance between him and the world. The opposite was true in most registers. He could hear frequencies that no human ear could access. He could sense the electromagnetic fields generated by large masses of moving water, which was a strange inheritance on a desert world but proved occasionally useful. He could feel, through the ground, the seismic activity of distant geological events. Not as earthquake prediction, though that capacity existed, but as a continuous background awareness of the planet's internal life, a kind of communion with geological time that had no parallel in any human sensory experience he could locate in the Ancestor archive. He wrote about the smell of spice with a specificity that the scholars who later read the journals found almost overwhelming in its precision. The melange had always been described in general terms: cinnamon, the scent of prophecy, the odour of sanctity in the Fremen religion. But Leto's account went far beyond these metaphors into a molecular specificity that suggested he was experiencing the substance at a level of resolution that no merely human sensory apparatus could have supported. He could distinguish, he wrote, between spice that had been exposed to sunlight and spice that had come from shadow, between fresh spice and spice that had been stored, between the spice from different areas of Arrakis, which differed subtly based on the specific mineral composition of the underlying rock and the age of the particular worm cycle that had produced it. This was not knowledge that had any direct strategic application. It was simply what it was like to inhabit a body that had been reorganized at the cellular level by 3.5 millennia of integration with the most complex organic molecule in the known universe. He found comfort in these catalogues. The precision of sensory description was one of the disciplines he used to stay present in the immediate, to counterbalance the vast temporal perspective that his prescience and his ancestor memories created. The smell of this specific spice, in this specific morning light, was not part of any long-term strategic calculation. It was just this, just now, just the world as it arrived in the particular form it took today, which would not be repeated exactly, which was already passing into the archive of things that had happened and would not happen again. He attended to it with a deliberateness that, in a smaller life, might have seemed excessive. In a life of his scale, it was necessary. The practice of keeping the immediate real when the long view was always available, and always threatening to make everything that was not part of it seem small. The air around you is the same air it was a few minutes ago, and yet something about it has shifted, grown slightly softer, slightly more accommodating. That is your body adjusting. That is the chemistry of rest beginning its quiet rearrangement. You do not need to do anything with that information. Just notice it, the way you might notice a change in the light outside without deciding what to think about it. 3,500 years. Say that number slowly and feel what it does to your sense of scale. 3,500 years before this moment, human beings were farming the first domesticated grains in river valleys that are now archaeological sites, were painting animals on cave walls that are now museums, were beginning the long experiment of civilization that produced eventually everything you know. And Leto II Atreides governed, not for a decade, not for a lifetime, but for the entire span between then and now, folded into a single continuous consciousness that never slept, never forgot, and never, not once, lost sight of why. One of the most visible consequences of his reign was something that his father Paul had actually wanted and that Leto allowed to continue, and then, with characteristic long patience, reversed. Arrakis was being terraformed. The ecological transformation project begun under the Fremen and continued under the Atreides was slowly, painstakingly, converting the desert planet into something wetter. Scrub grass on the windward slopes of dunes, moisture collectors along the rock faces, the gradual tenuous establishment of plant communities in the protected basins. It was working. And Leto let it work, for a while. Because the Fremen dream of a green Arrakis was real, and it was beautiful, and it deserved to be honoured long enough to demonstrate what it actually meant. What it meant, the part that took generations to fully understand, was the end of the Fremen as a people. The desert had made them. The desert's harshness, the still suits, the careful accounting of every drop of moisture, the Tiech communities bound together by the absolute necessity of mutual survival. All of that was the friction that had produced the Fremen's extraordinary character. Remove the friction and the character, gradually softened. The survival skills became ceremonial. The still suits became costume. Sit with that for a moment. Because this is not a comfortable idea. The thing that makes a people extraordinary is often the very thing that makes their lives hard, and a kind-hearted ruler, seeing the hardship, might remove it. And the people, freed from the hardship, would be grateful, and also diminished. Leto understood this with a clarity that made genuine kindness available to him only as a long-term instrument, never as an immediate response. He could not simply make things better. He could only arrange conditions under which eventually people would make themselves better. His Imperium was peaceful. This is worth stating plainly, and without the irony that is usually attached to it, because the peace was real, not merely the peace of a conquered people too broken to resist. There were no major wars during the first millennium of his reign, no plagues engineered by rival factions, no famines manufactured by economic manipulation. The infrastructure that moved food, medicine, and communication across the human-settled worlds was maintained with an efficiency that had no historical precedent. By many measures, by most ordinary measures, the people who lived under Leto II lived better, longer, safer lives than the people who had lived in any previous era, and they hated it. Not immediately. Not in the first generation, which remembered the chaos before Leto and was grateful for the calm. Not in the second generation, which accepted the calm as the natural state of the universe. But by the third generation, and the fourth, and certainly by the 10th, the peace had become a weight. Not oppression in any form that left bruises or emptied treasuries. Something more insidious. the sense that the future had been arranged, that the space in which a person might take a risk or make a mistake or fail in an interesting direction had been carefully carpeted over, the sense that no matter what you did, the world would continue in the direction Leto had decided it would continue. This is the oldest problem of the philosopher king, and Leto knew it better than anyone who had ever articulated it, because he was living it in real time across centuries. The ruler who knows better does worse by acting on that knowledge, because human beings do not grow in the absence of the freedom to choose badly. The gardener who props every plant upright produces flowers that cannot stand on their own. The parent who removes every obstacle produces a child who does not know how to encounter one. Leto was running this experiment at civilizational scale deliberately, with full knowledge of what it was producing. He was producing a species that desperately wanted to run. He was building the pressure that would one day make the scattering not just possible but necessary, not just desirable but existentially urgent. The confinement was the preparation. The resentment was the fuel. Inside him, the ancestor voices weighed their own opinions. This is one of the aspects of Leto's experience that is easiest to underestimate. He was not alone in his decisions in any ordinary sense. Every choice he made was made in the presence of an internal parliament of thousands, all of whom had perspectives, all of whom had lived through things that were relevant to the question at hand, many of whom disagreed with each other and with him. He had learned, it had taken him centuries to fully learn, not to let the crowd govern him. The voices were counsel. He was the one who had to act, but they were present. They were always present. The accumulated grief of every human life that had contributed to his lineage, the accumulated joy, the accumulated terror and love and regret, all of it running as a background current beneath his official thoughts, the way the deep aquifer ran beneath the desert of Arrakis. He was the most lonely being who had ever existed in human history, and the least alone. His administration across 3.5 millennia required, of course, enormous practical machinery. He governed from Arrakeen, from a fortress that expanded and contracted across centuries as his needs changed. He maintained the fish speakers, his all-female army, a choice so deliberate and so psychologically precise that it requires its own examination. He maintained the guild carefully, keeping the spice flowing to keep the navigators able to fold space, keeping the human worlds connected to each other across the void. He received ambassadors. He conducted audiences. He issued judgments on disputes that had been appealed up through the administrative layers of his empire until they reached his direct attention. He did not sleep these audiences away. He was present for them, a vast, still, altered presence that most who encountered it found either profoundly calming or profoundly disturbing, depending on what they had expected to find. And woven through all of it, through the decades and the centuries and the slow grinding of administrative time, was a project he pursued with such patience and such secrecy that most of his advisors across his entire reign never fully understood what they were participating in. He was breeding someone. He was selecting, generation by generation, for a specific and very strange genetic gift, the ability to be invisible to the future. The specific quality of patience required to govern a civilization for 35 centuries without losing the ability to be genuinely present for any given moment of it. This was not a capacity that Leto had arrived at fully formed. It was a discipline he had built over the first century of his reign through what might be called the practice of perpetual scale adjustment. He had to learn to inhabit the long view and the immediate view simultaneously, to hold the 3,000-year project in the same moment of awareness as the individual ambassador sitting before him in the audience chamber, the individual decision about a water allocation dispute in a Fremen community 300 kilometers from Arrakeen. Neither scale could be allowed to swamp the other. The long view without the immediate produces abstraction. The person who can see the arc of history but cannot see the person in front of them. The immediate without the long produces sentiment. The person who responds to what is visible with full emotional presence but cannot navigate the consequences of that response across time. Leto needed both. He cultivated both. And the instrument he used to cultivate them was, more than anything else, the audience itself. The daily, exhausting, occasionally tedious, and occasionally extraordinary practice of actually meeting people, of hearing their cases, of attending to the specific quality of each particular individual's situation and responding from the fullness of his capacity, rather than from the administrative shorthand that would have been easier and far less valuable. His advisors, over the centuries, sometimes questioned the efficiency of this. An emperor of his abilities, they suggested, could delegate far more than he did. The distillation of cases, the filtering of disputes through administrative layers until only the most significant reached him, the management of his time toward the decisions that genuinely required his unique capacities, all of this was within his reach and would have freed considerable bandwidth for the larger strategic work. He declined. Not because he was sentimental about the individual cases. He had been governing long enough that sentimentality was not available to him as a default response, but because the individual cases were his most reliable source of accurate information about what was actually happening in his empire. The reports that travelled up through administrative channels were accurate, in the way that all summarised information is accurate. They preserved the facts and lost the texture. What a person looked like when they described their situation, the specific emotional register of their grievance or their gratitude, the things they chose not to say because they were uncertain of the relevance or uncertain of how they would be received, all of that texture was the data that he could not afford to lose. It was the early warning system for the kind of slow systemic drift that never shows up in reports until it has already become a crisis. This is one of the aspects of his reign that his critics in later centuries found most difficult to reconcile with their image of him as the supreme tyrant. Tyrants, in the historical record that Leto carried, were characterized by a specific kind of information management. They received only what flattered their existing beliefs, filtered by advisors who had learned that accurate, unwelcome information was personally costly. Leto was the opposite of this. He structured his court and his access specifically to ensure a constant supply of uncomfortable truth. The Duncans were part of this. The individual audience was part of this. The reports from the fish speakers in the field, which came to him unedited, were part of this. He was, in the particular way that made him most unsettling to simple political analysis, a tyrant who was actively working to see himself clearly. The freemen of the middle centuries of his reign developed a tradition that Leto found both moving and diagnostic in equal measure. They began, in certain Sietch communities, to perform the rituals of water discipline as theatrical ceremony rather than functional necessity. The still suit fittings, the moisture accounting, the careful conservation of every drop, these practices that had been survival technology for generations became, in the green-edged Arrakis of the 500th year, a way of honouring an ancestor mode of being that was already being lost in the present one. Anthropologists in Leto's court who were permitted to observe these ceremonies, and he permitted it specifically wanting the documentation, noted that the performers were earnest, that they took the ceremonies seriously, that there was genuine feeling in the gestures. What the ceremonies could not recover was the specific quality of attention that comes from doing something, because your life depends on it. The Fremen who had developed these practices had done so in conditions of absolute material exigency. The desert had been their adversary and their teacher simultaneously, and the relationship between them had been forged in conditions that left no room for the performative. When the forging conditions were gone, the form remained, but the substance that had given the form its particular weight did not. The ceremonies were honourable. They were also, in a way that the practitioners sensed without being able to fully name, hollow. Leto understood something about this that was important to him personally, something that went beyond the strategic observation about cultural vitality and decline. He understood it because he was doing a version of it himself, his maintenance of certain Atreides customs, certain forms of relationship and governance that had been natural expressions of who the Atreides were under the pressures of the old Imperium Asan. He was now maintaining those forms under conditions so different that the forms were, in some sense, honorary. The ceremony of the Atreides without the full context that had made the Atreides. He was not sure whether this made the ceremony worthless or whether it preserved something genuinely valuable. He was not sure whether the distinction mattered. He kept the forms. They were what he had. Notice how the darkness behind your closed eyes is not really darkness. It has texture to it, a warmth, a slight luminous quality that comes from your own visual cortex being gently active even in rest. That is your mind doing what it does, finding pattern, finding presence, even in the absence of input. You do not have to attend to it. Just let it be there, the way a candle can be in a room without demanding that you look at it. Every ruler needs an army. The question of what kind of army reveals more about the ruler's philosophy than almost any other single decision, more than their economic policies, more than their declarations, more than their alliances. An army is a theory about human nature made visible and armed. And Leto II's theory was one of the most unsettling and carefully considered in all of speculative history. He chose women, not because women were more obedient. His fish speakers were not obedient in any ordinary sense. They were ferociously capable and self-determining within the structure he built. Not because women were more loyal. Loyalty of the simplistic kind was exactly what he did not want. He chose women because he had lived through the accumulated memory of every male army in human history, and what he had found in that memory was a consistent and terrible pattern. Armies of men, given sufficient shared purpose and sufficient distance from ordinary life, had an almost gravitational tendency toward atrocity, not because men are cruel, but because the specific psychology of male group bonding under stress, across centuries and cultures and technologies, had produced results he was not willing to replicate for 3,500 years. The fish speakers were not an army in the sense of a force designed primarily for conquest. They were an administrative organ that happened to be armed. Their primary function was not warfare but presence, the maintenance of Leto's peace through a distributed network of people who were genuinely committed to what that peace represented, not merely following orders. They trained, they were formidable. In the rare situations where force was necessary, they were effective without the enthusiasm for destruction that Leto had observed so consistently in male military institutions. There is something here worth examining slowly because it is one of the places where Leto's thinking cuts against the comfortable grain of easy interpretation. He was not making a utopian statement about gender. He was not saying that women are inherently more peaceful or more ethical. He was saying something more specific and more uncomfortable. That the particular configuration of biology, psychology, and social conditioning that produces a male soldier in a male army, when you run that configuration across millennia of uninterrupted military culture, produces a specific kind of institutional danger that he had decided to remove from his power structure. It was empirical, not ideological. He had the data. The data spanned 10,000 years. The fish speakers knew this, not all of them, not consciously, not as a formal part of their training. But the institutional culture that Leto cultivated in them contained the knowledge at its foundation, the way a building's architectural decisions contain the engineer's understanding of stress even when the people living in the building have never thought about load-bearing walls. What the fish speakers felt for Leto was not simple. It was not the idolatrous devotion of a cult, though from the outside it could resemble one. It was something more complex. The relationship of people who have been given genuine work, work that matters, work whose purpose they understand and endorse, with the person who gave them that work and continues to be present for it. They were not worshippers. They were participants. Many of them, over the centuries, fell in love with him. This was not managed or discouraged or encouraged. It was simply acknowledged as a thing that happened when you spent significant time in the presence of a being of Leto's depth and strangeness. He was the most fully realized person who had ever existed, in the sense of having inhabited more of the possible range of human experience than anyone else, and that fullness was palpable. People felt seen by him in a way that had nothing to do with his prescience, and everything to do with the quality of his attention when he chose to turn it toward you. He was also, always, unreachable. The membrane saw to that. The devotion that was given to him could not be received in the ordinary way, could not be answered with the ordinary currencies of touch and warmth and reciprocal vulnerability. He could receive their love intellectually. He could honour it. He could act from it. Governance decisions made in part because of his genuine care for the people who served him. But he could not hold them. Could not, in the full sense of the word, be held. The relationship had a direction to it that could not be fully reversed, and everyone involved felt the asymmetry, even when they could not name it. But the fish speakers served a purpose beyond the administrative and the psychological. They were, in the way that most things Leto did, served multiple purposes simultaneously, also part of the long project of preparing humanity for the scattering. An all-female military force that had governed the human worlds for 35 centuries would, when the moment came and the structure collapsed, fragment in a very specific way. The fish speakers would not consolidate power among themselves. They did not have the institutional habit of territorial accumulation that would have produced that outcome. They would instead disperse, carry their training and their values and their extraordinary competence out into the void along with everyone else, become the seed population of 1,000 different futures rather than the administrators of one controlled one. Leto had seen what happens when an empire collapses and leaves behind a standing army with nowhere to direct its purpose. He had seen it in the memory archives of 100 fallen civilizations. He was not going to leave that inheritance. When he was gone, the force that had kept his peace would not become the force that enforced someone else's. It would simply become people, skilled, capable, trained people, dispersing into the void that was waiting for them. But before all of that, before the dispersal, before the scattering, before the end that he had been building towards since the beginning, there was the question of the man who kept dying and being brought back, century after century, in bodies that were always slightly different and memories that were always slightly incomplete. There was the question of Duncan Idaho. The fish speaker's training was organized around what Leto had identified from the ancestor memories as the most reliable predictor of institutional longevity under stress, the capacity for independent ethical judgment within a shared framework. They were not trained to follow orders without question. They were trained to understand, at a level that was genuinely internalized rather than merely recited, the reasoning behind the framework they were operating within, so that when a situation arose that the framework did not explicitly address, they could extend it correctly, rather than defaulting to either rigid rule-following or complete improvisation. This kind of training is extremely difficult to achieve and extremely rare in military institutions, because it requires the institution to trust its members with the reasons for things, which is always a more exposed position than simply issuing directives. Leto trusted them with the reasons. Not all of them, not all at once. The Golden Path was not disclosed as a full strategic document to any individual or group during his reign, but the immediate purposes, the near-term reasoning, the specific ethical logic of particular decisions, these he shared through the institution's culture, if not through explicit declaration. A fish speaker who had served for 20 years would have absorbed, through the texture of her work and the conversations that surrounded it, a reasonably accurate picture of what the institution was for and why it was structured as it was. That picture was enough to enable judgment. What they carried out into the scattering, when his reign ended and the structure dissolved, was therefore not just training but understanding. They knew how to build institutions that prioritized the development of independent ethical capacity over obedience. They knew, in their cells, in the habits of mind they had developed across decades of practice, that the purpose of an authority structure is not to concentrate judgment at the top, but to distribute it as widely as possible, while maintaining enough coherence for collective action. They would teach this. In the new communities they seeded across the scattered human universe, in the institutions they helped build and the cultures they influenced, this understanding would persist, not as doctrine, but as practice, the way any deep knowledge persists, by being used. Leto had thought about this specifically. He had worried, in the quiet of the early centuries, about the kind of authority vacuum that follows the collapse of a very centralized system. He'd seen it in the ancestor memories, the fall of Rome, the fall of the Han dynasty, the collapse of the various imperial structures that had organized large populations across human history. Each collapse left behind institutions that had been shaped by the specific demands of the centralized system and could not easily adapt to the absence of that center. He was not going to leave that inheritance. The fish speakers were, in this as in everything, prepared for the ending. The question of why Leto chose an exclusively female military force was asked, across his reign, by virtually every ambassador who spent enough time in his court to feel comfortable raising it. His answers varied by audience, not because he was being deceptive, but because different interlocutors were equipped to receive different aspects of a multi-layered answer. To military historians, he gave the empirical argument, the specific institutional failure modes of male armies across 10 millennia of recorded conflict, the consistency of the pattern across cultures and technologies, the conclusion that the pattern was not contingent but structural. To philosophers he gave the paradox argument, that an army designed not to expand its own power is an instrument with no internal constituency for abuse of that power, and that gendered institutional culture, whatever its other limitations, had in the historical record reliably produced different default orientations toward territorial accumulation. To the Bene Gesserit, who asked with the particular sharpness of people who had their own framework for thinking about gender and power and institutional design, he gave only a long look and the observation that they had themselves been making the same argument for 10,000 years without stating it explicitly. The fish speakers' relationship to violence was another aspect of their design that took generations to become fully clear in practice. They were trained for it. They were genuinely capable of it. But the institutional culture that Leto had built into their formation placed violence firmly in the category of last resort, not as a rule to be followed, but as an understanding to be internalized, the understanding that force deployed in service of order produces, over time, a definition of order that becomes dependent on the continuous deployment of force. The fish speakers were not pacifists. They were people who understood, at the level of professional formation, the specific self-perpetuating logic of institutionalized violence, and who had been given enough history and enough philosophical grounding to recognize when they were being invited into that logic and to find other ways of achieving the same end. Leto watched the fish speakers develop their own culture across the centuries, with a quality of attention that was neither parental nor proprietary, something more like the attention of a person who has planted a garden and finds, year after year, that the garden is producing things the planting did not predict. They had their own music, their own ceremony, distinct from any of the cultures they had been drawn from initially, something that had developed organically from the specific experience of being them, of being women who held the peace of a God Emperor's empire, who did it with competence and without performance, who knew each other across generations and across the 1,000 different worlds where fish-speaker contingents maintained their presence. They were a civilization within the civilization, and what they were building was neither what Leto had designed nor something he could have designed. It was what emerged from the design being lived in by actual people, over actual time. He found this, consistently, the most encouraging thing about his reign. The rhythm of your breathing has changed without your having to direct it. That is the body's own intelligence working, the part of you that knows how to rest better than the thinking part does, that does not need instruction or discipline, that simply given the right conditions returns to its most fundamental state. You're in those conditions now. The thinking can follow later. For now, just the breath. There is a question that runs underneath the story of Leto II like a second, quieter story. A question about what it costs to carry love across an inhuman span of time. The Sandtrout membrane cost him ordinary touch. The ancestor voices cost him a certain quality of silence that most people take for granted. The golden path cost him the small human life of wants and changes and surprises. But the thing that cost him most continuously, the thing that functioned across 35 centuries as the most precise and unrelenting reminder of what he had given up, was a man named Duncan Idaho. Duncan Idaho had been the swordmaster of House Atreides, Leto's grandfather's man, then Leto's father Paul's. A warrior of exceptional skill and more exceptional character, honest in a way that the political world of the Imperium found uncomfortable, loyal in a way that was not contingent on outcome or advantage. He had died defending Paul's mother Jessica from assassins. He had died at a moment of genuine heroism, in a moment of genuine choice, and the manner of his death had preserved something essential about who he was. The Tleilaxu, the genetic wizards, the masters of the axolotl tanks, the manipulators of biological material who practiced their arts in deliberate secrecy, and who were not, in any deep sense, trusted by anyone who understood them, had grown a Ghola from Duncan's cellular material. A Ghola was a clone with a difference. The body was genetically identical to the original, but the memories were gone. The Ghola would grow up without knowing who he was. The original personality might be recovered, might not, depending on conditions that the Tleilaxu understood better than anyone and disclosed to no one. Leto purchased the first Duncan Ghola from the Tleilaxu shortly after his reign began. He brought the Ghola into his court. He watched him grow into his recovered self, or some version of it. He valued the relationship that developed, and then, eventually, through treachery, through accident, through the ordinary attrition of a long reign, that Duncan died, and Leto ordered another. Sit with that for a moment. The specific quality of longing embedded in that act. A being who cannot be touched, who has outlived everyone he has ever known, who carries the memory of every version of love that the human species has ever expressed, purchasing the same man again. Not because the Ghola was exactly Duncan. He never was. Each iteration was the same genetic template shaped by different experiences, recovering different fractions of the original personality, arriving at the relationship with Leto from a slightly different angle. But there was always something recognizable. There was always something that felt, to Leto, like coming back to a place you have not been in a very long time, and finding that it still smells the same. What Duncan, any given Duncan, gave Leto was something very specific and very rare in the context of his court: honest resistance. The Duncans, as they recovered their sense of self, reliably did not defer to Leto simply because he was a God Emperor. They pushed back, they questioned, they brought the specific discomfort of a genuinely independent perspective into a court that was, in all other respects, structured around deference. Leto cultivated this. He needed it the way a very still room needs a window, not because the wind is always welcome, but because the alternative is the air going stale. This also meant that the Duncans sometimes became threats. Sometimes a given Ghola, recovering his memories, recovering his personality, looking at what Leto had built and what Leto had become, would decide that the God Emperor needed to be opposed. And Leto would have to manage that. Sometimes through conversation, sometimes through the quiet administrative arrangements that kept a man occupied and directed, occasionally through a death that Leto grieved more than anyone outside that relationship could have understood. The Tleilaxu, for their part, found the arrangement useful in ways that went beyond the commercial. Each Duncan Ghola they produced was also an experiment, an opportunity to study the recovery of original personality across different environmental conditions, across different relationships with the same extraordinary stimulus that Leto represented. They were learning, not just about Duncan Idaho, but about what the axolotl tanks could do and what the relationship between genetic template and recovered self might eventually yield. They were also watching Leto. From a very safe distance, over a very long time, the Tleilaxu studied the God Emperor with the patience of people who had their own long-term agenda, and understood that the most valuable observations took decades to become clear. They were not allies. They were not enemies. They were biologists examining the longest-running experiment in human history. For Leto, the Duncan relationship functioned as the emotional economy of his reign, in a way that nothing else did. The fish speakers offered devotion, the Duncans offered conversation, the administrators offered efficiency, the Duncans offered surprise, the courtiers offered deference, the Duncans offered argument. In a life that had become, by structural necessity, a life of enormous control, the Duncans were the variable, the element that could not be fully predicted. The reminder that a relationship worth having is one where the other person can still, occasionally, do something you did not see coming. Across 35 centuries, Leto went through more than 10,000 Duncan Idaho Gholas. Each one's death was its own grief. Each one's arrival was its own complicated hope. The mathematics of that, the sheer accumulated weight of loss and return and loss again, is not something that any single human lifetime could contain. It required the specific capacity of Leto's altered mind, the ancestor voices absorbing each loss into the larger library, the worm patience allowing the grief to settle without overwhelming the function. And yet, despite all the Duncans, despite all the conversation and resistance and honest friction they provided, there remained something that even a Duncan could not give him: a full accounting of what his reign was doing to human memory, to human ambition, to the interior life of a species that had been told, in the softest possible terms, that the future had already been arranged. For that, Leto had to look inside himself. He had to look at the crowd. The Tleilaxu axolotl tanks were, for a long time, a deliberate mystery, one of the many deliberate mysteries that the Tleilaxu maintained as a matter of institutional practice, the way some families maintain private traditions that are never explained to outsiders and gain their power partly from that inexplicability. What the tanks were, what they produced, the biology of the process, this was kept private for centuries, revealed only gradually, and not fully understood by the larger human community until very late in Leto's reign. What was known was functional. The tanks could produce Ghola bodies from cellular material. What was not known was the nature of the tanks themselves. The tanks were women, Tleilaxu women, transformed through a process that had been developed over generations from something that had once been reproductive biology into something that was now a manufacturing process. The women reduced, if reduced is the right word, and it is a word that carries a complicated weight here, to the biological machinery of the process. They were alive. They were aware, to some degree, that the Tleilaxu found theologically convenient to not fully examine. They produced the Ghola bodies the way a womb produces a child, except that the process had been extended and modified, and the women who underwent it did not return from it in any ordinary sense. Leto knew this. He had known it from early in his reign, from the ancestor voices who carried fragments of the knowledge, and from his own intelligence sources, which were extensive, and he continued to purchase the Duncan Gholas. This is one of the places where the ethical simplicity of the story, if it ever had any, becomes most genuinely complicated. He needed the Duncans. The Golden Path required the Duncans in ways that were more subtle than any single strategic function they served. They were his connection to honest relationship, to the experience of being known rather than worshipped, to something that functioned as humanizing pressure in a life that had every structural incentive to become entirely abstract. The cost of that connection was his participation in a system that he found morally abhorrent. He worked over the centuries to find alternatives, to develop technologies and relationships that might eventually make the Tleilaxu process unnecessary. He never fully succeeded during his reign, and so he continued and carried the knowledge of what that continuation meant, and added it to the accumulated weight of what the Golden Path cost. Not all of the costs were strategic or personal. Some of them were ethical, in the plain sense of the word. He was doing wrong in order to do right, and he knew it, and he did not allow himself the comfort of pretending otherwise. The Duncan who appeared in the final century of Leto's reign, the one who would ultimately be part of the Bridge conspiracy, was, by the accounts of those who knew both, the most complicated iteration in the entire sequence. He had recovered his original memories more fully than most, which meant he had access to the clearest possible picture of who Duncan Idaho had been, and the clearest possible measure of the distance between that person and what he was now. He was not the Swordmaster of House Atreides. He was a copy of that person, grown in a tank, shaped by the specific circumstances of Leto's court, carrying the original's memories as a kind of inheritance he had not chosen. This awareness was, for him, not a philosophical abstraction, but a daily lived condition. He asked Leto, in one of their conversations, a conversation that both of them understood might be one of the last, what it was like to be the continuity. To be the fixed point around which all these different Duncans had orbited, each one slightly different, each one lost. Leto answered without the pause he usually took before answering complicated questions, as if the answer had been ready for a very long time. He said, like being the shore does not change the sea does not change the shore, but they have been in conversation so long that neither is entirely itself without the other, and the conversation has no beginning you can point to, and no end that is yet visible. The Duncan considered this for a while, and then said that he was not sure the shore had a choice about being there. Leto agreed. He said that the shore very rarely does. The conversation ended there, not because either of them was unwilling to continue it, but because that particular ending had a quality that made adding to it feel like a diminishment. Two beings who understood each other across an enormous gap of difference and history, arriving briefly at a point of genuine mutual recognition, and then allowing that moment to be what it was, complete in itself, not requiring anything further. It was one of the moments Leto carried into the final phase of his reign, as evidence that what he had built, for all its costs, had also contained this: the possibility of genuine meeting across genuine difference. There is a particular quality to the mind in the late hours of the night, when tiredness has softened the edges of ordinary thinking without fully releasing the capacity for thought, a kind of open, receptive quiet where things can be considered without the usual friction of judgment and analysis. You may be in that state now. It is a good state. It requires nothing of you. Let the story come in the way water comes into a quiet harbour, without the drama of waves, just the slow, unremarkable arrival of depth. Inside Leto II, Atreides, a library was breathing, not metaphorically. The ancestor memories he carried were not static archives, not records to be retrieved and read and replaced. They were active. They responded to events. When Leto encountered a new situation, the relevant voices would stir, not intruding, not demanding, but present, offering the weight of their own experience the way the smell of rain on stone offers the weight of every previous storm without naming them. He carried the Atreides line back to its founding. He carried Fremen voices, men and women who had walked the deep desert, who knew the quality of silence in a cavern 100 meters below the dunes, who had measured their lives in water and taught him to do the same. He carried voices from the Bene Gesserit, women of extraordinary training and discipline whose interior landscapes were the most orderly he had inherited, whose presence in the crowd was calming in the way that an extremely organized person's company is calming when everything around you is complex. He carried voices that predated recorded history. Faint, partial, sometimes no more than an emotional residue attached to a physical sensation. The feel of a particular kind of cold, a particular quality of hunger, the specific joy of a fire built in open air after days of rain. These oldest voices were the most mysterious to him. They had no language he could access, no narrative structure. They were pure experience, preserved in the cellular memory of the lineage the way a fossil preserves the shape of something that no longer exists. Managing this crowd required the most sustained and subtle discipline of his reign. Not because the voices were difficult, most of them, most of the time, were not demanding his attention, but because the risk was not an acute crisis of overwhelming input. The risk was gradual dilution. The risk was the particular psychological dissolution that happens when you spend too much time with other people's perspectives and not enough time with your own, when the boundary between your experience and the experiences you're carrying begins to soften in ways you do not notice until it has already gone too far. Leto had developed, over centuries, an interior practice he never fully explained to anyone. Not a meditation in the way that word implies a withdrawal from awareness, but something more like a regular deliberate act of re-identification. A returning to the specific coordinates of his own perspective, not the ancestor who had once stood in a desert, but this one, in this body, on this day, with these particular responsibilities and this particular view out this particular window. The voices were real. They were also not him. The discipline was in holding both truths simultaneously. What the crowd taught him, most consistently, across centuries of their collective wisdom being available to him, was humility about prediction. This might seem paradoxical, a prescient being taught humility about the future by the accumulated past. But the ancestor voices had all been, in their own time, intelligent people who had made confident predictions that turned out to be wrong in specific, instructive ways. They had been wrong about what their children would value, they had been wrong about what technologies would persist, they had been wrong, most commonly, about what other people were actually experiencing beneath the surface of what those people were presenting. This knowledge of the many specific ways in which even very intelligent, very informed people can misread the future kept Leto honest in his prescience. He knew his foresight was real. He also knew that foresight is not omniscience, that seeing a direction of travel is not the same as seeing every deviation, every detour, every individual who would surprise the path by refusing to follow it. The voices did not always agree with each other, and they did not always agree with him. There had been periods, the most difficult periods of his reign, the moments when the accumulated ethical weight of what he was doing pressed hardest against him, when the crowd was genuinely divided. Voices that had lived through tyranny of various kinds would argue, from their specific experience, that what he was doing was indistinguishable from what they had suffered. Voices that had lived through the specific chaos he was preventing would counter with their own experience, equally specific, equally felt. He held all of it. That was the work. Not resolving the argument could not be resolved, because both sides were right from within their own frames of reference. The work was holding the unresolved argument and acting anyway, in the full knowledge that he was choosing one genuine harm over another genuine harm, and that the choice was his, and that no ancestor voice could make it for him. There was a gift in all of this that is easy to miss. Leto was, by virtue of the crowd, incapable of the most common failure of long-term power, the narrowing of empathy that comes from spending too long surrounded by people who are positioned to agree with you. Every ruler tends toward a court that reflects their own perspective back at them in increasingly polished forms. Every perspective, over time, develops blind spots that the people around it have learned not to point to. Leto had 10,000 years of people who had not learned to agree with him, who had never had the opportunity, who had been preserved in their own pre-Leto integrity, living in his memory and offering their honest reactions to everything he did. He was, in a sense, perpetually audited, not by an external body, but by the full weight of human experience as it had accumulated up to the moment of his birth. He could not pretend, even to himself, that what he was doing was simple. He could not comfort himself with the flattery of court or the agreement of administration. The crowd knew too much. They had seen too many versions of this, and yet none of them, not one voice in the entire population he carried, had ever governed the way he was governing. For that, there was no precedent to consult. For the museum he was building of frozen human ambition, for the deliberate stagnation he was engineering with such care, he was working entirely without a map. Among the ancestor voices, there were beings whose experience of time resembled Leto's own more than most. Not in scale. No one in the archive had lived 3.5 millennia, but in quality. The Bene Gesserit Reverend Mothers who had taken the water of life and survived it, had, in that moment of transformation, absorbed all the memories of all the Reverend Mothers who preceded them, in a flood that most did not survive, and those who did survive described uniformly as the most disorienting experience of their lives. The voices in their memory had been wild and overwhelming in the first months after the transformation. It took years, for most of them, to build the internal structure that allowed them to inhabit the archive without being dissolved by it. These voices were, for Leto, some of the most useful guides in the early period of his reign. They had done a version of what he was doing, had found ways to organize an overwhelming inheritance of other people's experience into something that served rather than consumed the current person. Their specific techniques had not translated directly. His situation was different in too many ways for any direct application. But the principle they had developed, the fundamental practice of establishing a clear and defended sense of individual perspective before engaging with the archive, had been exactly what he needed to orient himself in those first decades. There was one voice in particular, a Reverend Mother from 2,000 years before his birth, a woman whose name had not survived the archive intact but whose specific quality of perspective had, who had developed what Leto came to think of as the most elegant solution to the problem of being a living archive. She had stopped trying to organize the voices into a usable library. She had stopped trying to retrieve specific memories on demand and file them in accessible categories. She had instead developed a relationship with the archive that resembled the relationship a skilled musician has with a very large repertoire. She did not consciously know all of it, but when a situation arose that was relevant to something she carried, the relevant material would surface on its own, the way the right phrase of music surfaces when you're trying to describe a feeling. The archive became intuition, the voices became instinct. Leto adapted this approach across his first century, and found it transformed the experience of carrying the crowd from something that required constant management to something that was simply, most of the time, part of how he thought. The voices did not demand attention. They informed the way everything a person has ever read and experienced informs their thinking without requiring them to consciously retrieve it. And in situations of genuine novelty, situations that the archive had no direct precedent for, the absence of relevant input became its own kind of information. The silence of the ancestors was, sometimes, the clearest indication that he was in territory where the past was not the guide. There were nights, or what passed for nights in the continuous presence existence of the God Emperor, when the crowd was simply too much, when the accumulated weight of 10,000 years of human experience, the grief and the joy and the terrible complexity of all those lives, pressed against the interior walls of his awareness with a force that the discipline could not fully contain. He did not speak about these moments widely. They were in the journals, in passages written in the most compressed of his private notation systems, and the scholars who decoded them debated for decades whether what he was describing was a psychological state or something more fundamental, a structural characteristic of the kind of awareness he had built, an irreducible cost of the integration. What he described, in his own terms, was not despair. He was careful about that word, careful not to claim for himself a suffering that had a simpler name than what he was actually experiencing. It was more like the sensation of being a vessel that was slightly too small for what it contained. Not cracking, not failing structurally, but under a pressure that was constant and that could not be reduced by any adjustment he had found. The crowd was not a burden he could set down. The voices were not noise he could reduce by closing a door. They were constitutive. They were part of what he was, and what he was, on these difficult nights, almost too much for the framework that housed it. He had found, over the centuries, that the most effective response was also the simplest. He would choose one voice, one ancestor, one person from the archive, and he would attend to that voice exclusively for a time, not analysing it, not drawing strategic conclusions from it, not using it in any instrumental way, just being with it, just allowing one human life, in its full specific particularity, to be the entire foreground of his awareness, while the rest of the crowd receded to the background, where they spent most of their time. The voice he chose on these occasions was not always one he knew well or found comforting. Sometimes it was the most alien voice in his archive, the most distant in time, the most different in cultural context, the one whose experience bore the least resemblance to his own. He chose it deliberately for that distance. The strangeness was restoring. It reminded him that the crowd was not a single vast thing, but a collection of irreducibly specific people, each entirely themselves, each carrying a life that was not reducible to its contribution to the long arc of history. That specificity was the cure for the occasions when the archive threatened to become merely pressure. The quiet has deepened. You can feel it in the way the sounds of the world beyond you have receded, not disappeared, but moved to a different distance, as if they belonged to a street you used to live on rather than the room you are in now. That is the mind reorganizing its sense of what is near and what is far. It does this on its own when you allow it to. You are allowing it. That is all that is asked. Consider what it would mean to deliberately make a civilization boring, not cruel, not impoverished, not at war or in chaos, or in the grip of any of the obvious forms of suffering that historians use as markers of bad eras. Simply boring, stable beyond the threshold at which stability becomes its own kind of cage, predictable beyond the point at which predictability stops being comforting and starts being suffocating. That was the project. That was what Leto called, privately, the Museum Fremen, the preservation of human forms without human vitality, the keeping of the shape while the animating urgency drained slowly away. The economic structure of Leto's Imperium was deliberately resistant to the kind of explosive innovation that produces sudden change. Not by banning technology, Leto was not interested in enforced primitivism, which he understood from the ancestor voices to be as fragile and artificial as any other controlled environment. Instead, he governed the incentive structures. The arrangements by which people were rewarded for their work were calibrated subtly and over centuries to favour the maintenance of existing systems over the creation of new ones. Doing well what was already being done was valued. Doing something that had never been done before was not prohibited, but also not especially rewarded. The effect was gradual and cumulative in the way that all the most significant effects of his reign were. In the first century, innovation simply slowed from the frenetic pace of the pre-Leto era. In the second century, certain categories of technological development began to cluster, becoming variations on established forms rather than genuine departures. By the 5th century, there were human institutions, universities, research bodies, guilds of scholarship, that had been doing essentially the same work in essentially the same way for 200 years, and had produced, in that time, refinements and elaborations, but no genuinely new questions. Sit with that for a moment, because there is something in that image that resonates beyond the fictional frame of Dune. Every era has its version of a Leto's museum, the institutions that calcify, the conversations that stop generating new ideas and start generating more polished versions of old ones, the moments in a society or a culture or a relationship when the animating question has been answered and what remains is administration. The question Frank Herbert was embedding in this story, the question Leto was designed to embody, is not whether stagnation is bad. Everyone agrees stagnation is bad. The question is whether the freedom that prevents stagnation can be guaranteed, whether it can be built into a system such that it does not require a catastrophe to restore. Leto's answer was no. Freedom requires the real possibility of danger to remain genuine. You cannot engineer freedom into a stable system. You can only engineer conditions under which the need for it becomes overwhelming. The philosophical class of Leto's Imperium spent considerable energy on the problem of what they called the stagnation. Not Leto's word, he had not given it a name in any public forum, but theirs, arrived at independently, the way that people in a very quiet room will independently become aware of the same sound. They debated causes. They proposed solutions that were, in each case, solutions Leto had already foreseen and had already quietly arranged to be inconclusive. Not because he wanted them to fail intellectually, but because the solution they were looking for required a premise he had removed. The premise that the ruler is also improvising. A system that allows a ruler to genuinely respond to genuine uncertainty produces sometimes chaos. It produces sometimes catastrophic errors, but it also produces genuine engagement from the ruler and from the ruled. The question of what happens next is alive. Under Leto, the question of what happened next had one answer. Leto happened next, and Leto had been happening in the same direction for longer than anyone's great-great-great-grandparents could remember. Nowhere was the cost of his stagnation more visible or more deliberately maintained than in what had happened to the Fremen people. The Fremen who had been in Paul Muad'Dib's revolutionary army, who had swept across the Imperium in the jihad that Paul had not been able to stop. Those Fremen had been among the most psychologically formidable human beings who had ever existed. Their hardship had made them extraordinary, fierce, communal, inventive, deeply connected to the planet they lived on and to each other. Leto had, over centuries, softened the conditions that produced those qualities. Not entirely. He maintained enough friction to preserve the form, but enough that what called itself Freeman by the 30th century was, in practice, a ceremonial culture. People who wore the clothes, performed the rituals, used the words, without the lived urgency that had given those clothes and rituals and words their meaning. He had done this on purpose, not out of cruelty toward the Freemen specifically, out of the same logic that governed everything. A people too comfortable in their current form would not produce the wild, desperate, creative, dangerous people who would be needed when the museum's doors finally came off their hinges. There was a hidden curriculum in all of this, not hidden from Leto. He was, as always, entirely clear-eyed about what he was doing, but hidden from the people living through it. The hidden curriculum was, this is what happens when safety is the only value. This is what becomes of a species that has been arranged into complete security. And the lesson was being taught through direct experience rather than through any text or lecture, because Leto understood, from 10,000 years of ancestor memory, that direct experience is the only pedagogy that sticks. When the pressure finally broke, when his death finally came and the scattering began, the people who flooded out into the unknown stars would not need to be told that safety without freedom is a slow diminishment. They would know it in their bodies, in the restlessness that had been building for generations, in the specific and unreasonable and wonderful human hunger for the uncontrolled unknown. But Leto's project was not only negative. It was not only the removal of freedom in order to manufacture the desperate craving for it. There was a positive element, a thing he was building toward rather than just away from, and that element had a face. It had a name. It had been bred with extraordinary precision across generations, and it was in many ways the most intimate and the most devastating thing Leto had ever done. The artists were a particular case study in how stagnation worked at the most granular level of human creative life. Leto attended to the arts the way he attended to everything, with genuine interest and with the long-term strategic eye that could not be entirely turned off. What he observed, across centuries of artistic production in his Imperium, was a pattern that the ancestor voices recognized immediately, and that any honest art historian would have recognized as well. In the early period of any settled artistic tradition, when the rules are new and the practitioners are still discovering what can be done within them, there is an extraordinary outpouring of work that is both formally excellent and genuinely surprised by its own possibilities, discovering in the act of making what the form is capable of. Then, gradually, the tradition clarifies into mastery. The rules are understood. The range of the possible within the established form is mapped. And what follows is refinement, increasingly perfect execution of increasingly well-understood possibilities, with genuine novelty becoming rarer and more precious because there is less unmapped territory to find it in. Under ordinary historical conditions, this cycle is broken by external shocks, invasions, plagues, technological changes, the collision of one tradition with another that has been developing independently. The shock scrambles the settled understanding, forces the artist to rebuild from new foundations, and in the rebuilding, new territory opens. Leto's long piece removed the shocks. The artistic traditions of his Imperium were completing their third and fourth cycles of refinement in certain forms, the equivalent of a musical tradition that had produced Baroque, classical, romantic and modern periods, and was now producing a kind of post-everything that was technically extraordinary and emotionally hermetically sealed. He watched this with a feeling that was not quite sadness and not quite satisfaction. The stagnation in the arts was, like the stagnation in everything, evidence that the project was working, evidence that the pressure was building, that the hunger for something genuinely new was approaching the threshold at which it would be the dominant motivating force in human culture. When the scattering came, the first generation of artists to work in the genuinely unknown territory of the New Worlds would produce things he could not imagine, and he would never see. That was, he had decided, one of the more generous aspects of the gift he was giving, an art that no one had yet made in territories no mind like his could follow. There were rebels, of course, artists who rejected the refined tradition not in the systematic way of a new movement, but in the personal way of individuals who could not work within walls they found suffocating. Some of them came to his attention. He watched them with particular care and particular protection, making sure that the administrative weight of his imperium did not inadvertently crush them before they had produced whatever it was they were working toward. He could not create the conditions for their work to flourish fully. That would have required a genuine freedom he was not yet ready to extend. But he could ensure that the conditions for their survival were maintained, that the impulse they were expressing was not killed off but preserved, like a seed in cold storage, waiting for the warmth of the world that was coming. The historians of the post-scattering era, working with the records that had survived the transition, and with the Leto journals as their primary source, debated for generations what to call what he had done. Tyranny was the easy word and the inadequate one. Tyranny, as a political category, describes a system that serves the tyrant's interests at the expense of the people's. Leto's system served no interest of his that could be easily named. He had no financial interest, no territorial ambition, no vanity to be managed, no fear of replacement to be suppressed. The standard mechanisms by which political power becomes self-serving were simply absent from his case. What he had was a vision of human futures that he considered more important than any current human preference, and he had organized the civilization to serve that vision rather than the preferences of the people living in it. There was a name for that too, but it was not tyranny. It was something more complicated, more morally ambiguous, and more genuinely difficult to evaluate from any position that was not his. Some of the most thoughtful post-scattering historians eventually settled on the phrase custodial imperialism, a form of centralized power exercised in the name of the subject population's long-term benefit rather than the ruler's short-term advantage. The phrase captured something true and lost something equally true, the way all phrases do. What it captured, the genuine care, the genuine long-term orientation, the genuine subordination of personal comfort to strategic purpose. What it lost, the violence implicit in the decision to override a species' choices for its own good, the assumption of superior knowledge that underlies all custodial arrangements, the question of who granted the custodian their authority, and whether that question can ever be satisfactorily answered by the custodian themselves. Leto would have accepted both the capture and the loss. He had by the end no interest in a comfortable accounting of himself. What he wanted, and the journals make this clear in their final section, in the passages written when the prescience was already blurring and the physical deterioration had begun, what he wanted was an honest accounting. He wanted the people who came after him to look at what he had done and see it clearly, to neither mythologize him into a saviour nor simplify him into a villain, to hold the full complexity and find in that complexity whatever was useful for the work they had ahead of them. He was not asking to be forgiven. He was asking to be understood, which is a different and harder thing, and the request was made with the specific quality of hope that belongs to a person who has done something enormous and irreversible, and knows that the final verdict will come from futures they cannot see. The weight of the night is fully around you now, not a heavy weight, not the weight of something pressing down, but the weight of something holding you, the way still water holds a floating thing without effort, without any action required from either the water or the thing being held. This is what the late hours do when you let them. They hold. You do not have to do anything with that. Just allow it. The Tleilaxu across the centuries of Leto's reign had been watching him with a very specific and patient intention. They were, in their own cosmology, a deeply devout people. Their religious framework was intricate and private and not shared with outsiders, but it organized their relationship to the work they did and the role they believed themselves to be playing in the larger story of humanity. And the larger story, as they read it, required the God Emperor to fall, not to be defeated in any crude military sense. They understood perfectly well that he could not be defeated militarily, but to be reached, to be brought from inside his fortress of worm body and membrane and prescient awareness to the place where a human being can be made to act from love rather than calculation. They built a woman to do it. Hwi Noree, born in the axolotl tanks, the same tanks that produced the Ghola Duncans, the same biological machinery that the Tleilaxu had perfected over millennia. Hwi was not a Ghola. She was not a copy of anyone who had previously existed. She was an original, designed with extraordinary care to be, in every quality that could be encoded in biology and reinforced by environment, the most genuinely good person that the Tleilaxu's understanding of human character allowed them to produce. She was not manipulative. She was not a spy in any operational sense. She carried no false memories, no hidden instructions, no agenda she was unconsciously enacting. The Tleilaxu's design was more elegant and more terrible than that. They had simply created a person who was, by nature and by careful formation, everything that Leto, in his deepest, most honestly human longing, most needed to encounter. Warm, intellectually serious, curious about the world in the specific way that is most stimulating to a very large mind, and possessed of a moral clarity that was not naive but had been genuinely earned through the particular kind of intelligence that feels its way to understanding rather than calculating its way there. Hwi Noree knew what she had been designed to do in the sense that she understood her origins and the intention behind them. She did not deny it. She was not a person who could comfortably deny things. But knowing the intention did not make her into an instrument of that intention, because she was genuinely the person the Tleilaxu had designed her to be. And that person, encountering Leto II with full awareness of the context, found herself in a relationship that was real in all the ways that matter. She loved him, not as an act of mission, not as a role she was performing. She loved the specific actual being who sat before her in the audience chamber and spoke to her with an openness he did not extend to anyone else. The being who was tired in ways that could not be measured, who was lonely in ways that could not be adequately described, who had been doing the hardest work in human history for 35 centuries and had never had a partner who could fully receive what that meant. And Leto, who had foreseen her coming, who had known from his prescience that this was happening, who had seen the Tleilaxu's intention as clearly as he saw everything, loved her back. This is the most significant decision he made in the entire span of his reign, and it is the most human decision, to choose love that you know will cost you, because the alternative is to refuse love entirely, and that is not actually what wisdom recommends. He knew what the Tleilaxu hoped to accomplish. He knew that his attachment to Hwi would introduce a variable into the last phase of the Golden Path that he could not fully control, could not fully predict, could not arrange to come out in the optimal direction for his purposes. He loved her anyway. Not because he had lost his judgment, because he had never, in 35 centuries, lost the ability to recognize that a life, even an enormously extended, enormously purposeful, enormously disciplined life, that contains no love, is not an endorsement of any vision of human flourishing. It is its own kind of argument against. Their relationship was, by the nature of his body, conducted at a particular kind of distance. He could not hold her hand. He could not embrace her. The membrane was always between them. What they shared was conversation of extraordinary depth and range, the kind of conversation that happens when two people who have both thought very hard about very important things finally find each other across the improbable distance that separates such people. They talked about the Golden Path. She was, eventually, the person to whom he explained it most fully, not because he trusted her politically, but because she was the first person he had encountered in centuries who could hold the full complexity of what he was saying without flinching. She did not entirely agree with him. This mattered. She questioned the right he had granted himself to make these choices on behalf of a species that had not been asked. She offered, in her gentle and precise way, the challenge that the ancestor voices had never been able to offer. The challenge of a fully present, fully alive human being who loved him enough to tell him, carefully and without cruelty, where she thought he had gone wrong. The Tleilaxu had calculated that Hwi's arrival would destabilize him. They were right, in the sense that love destabilizes, not by weakening, but by complicating. The calculation that the Golden Path required was, with Hwi in the picture, a calculation conducted with a beating heart rather than a purely strategic mind. Leto made mistakes in the last phase of his reign that he would not have made without her. He was more vulnerable. He was also, by his own accounting, more himself. The distinction matters. The Golden Path was designed to save humanity, but it was designed by a being who had found a way to sustain purpose in the absence of love for 3.5 millennia. The Hwi question was whether a version of the golden path that included love, even at the cost of some strategic purity, was worth more or less than the version without it. He chose the version with love, and with that choice came an acceleration of the final phase, because the being who could love could also finally be genuinely and fully killed, and that too had always been part of the design. The conversations between Leto and Hwi Noree ranged across everything, in the way that conversations between two people who have found genuine intellectual companionship always eventually range across everything. Not because they are trying to be comprehensive, but because everything is connected and following one thread long enough always leads to another. They talked about the nature of prescience and its costs. They talked about the ancestor voices and what it was like to carry them, and she listened in a way that most people could not listen, not searching for implications or strategic uses in what she heard, but simply receiving it, holding it with the attention of someone who understands that the accurate receipt of what another person is trying to communicate is already a form of care. She asked him, once, what he missed most. Not an obvious question. Most people in his court understood that the category of things he missed was too large and too complicated to invite into casual conversation. She asked it with the specific directness that was her characteristic mode, the quality that had been designed into her and that had become genuinely hers. He considered the question for a long time, long enough that the silence in the room had settled into a different quality, the quality that comes when two people are comfortable enough not to fill a pause with noise. What he said was, rain. The smell of rain before it arrives, the particular shift in air pressure and chemistry that human sensory systems evolved to detect across millions of years of living under open sky, the specific quality of attention it produces, that combination of anticipation and receptivity, the body recognizing something it knows and loves before the mind has processed what is happening. He had the memory of it from 10,000 years of ancestors who had stood under open sky in 1,000 different kinds of weather on 100 different worlds. But the sandtrout membrane filtered the chemistry. The sensation was available to him as information but not as experience. He could know it was raining. He could not feel what rain was. Hwi did not say anything for a moment after that. Then she said that she would describe it to him, whenever it rained, as precisely as she could, every sensory element she could access. Not as a substitute, not as a consolation, just as a way of having it be more present. He accepted this offer with a gravity that suggested he understood exactly what it was and was not, and she kept it. For the duration of their time together, in whatever community of experience was available to them across the membrane and the distance and the asymmetry, she kept it. The Tleilaxu had not anticipated one consequence of their design. They had built Hwi to be genuinely good, and genuine goodness, in the specific form they had succeeded in producing it, extended to the people who had made her. She knew what the axolotl tanks were. She knew how she had been produced and at what cost. And she spent a portion of her time with Leto, in the quiet spaces between the large conversations, talking about this, not abstractly, not as an ethical exercise, but with the specific grief of a person who cannot separate her own existence from the process that produced it. She was alive because of something that she could not endorse. That condition, that impossible personal relationship with the question of one's own origins, was something that Leto understood with complete precision. He had been produced, in a meaningful sense, by 10,000 years of selective breeding that had treated human beings as instruments. His existence was inseparable from that history. He could not endorse it either. They talked about this specifically once, and it was one of the conversations that went to the centre of things, without either of them having intended to go there. She said that she had decided to live in the condition of not resolution, to hold the impossibility of her origins as a fact of her existence, without requiring it to determine how she met each day. She was not the tanks. She was not the Tleilaxu's intention. She was what had resulted, and what had resulted was her, and she was choosing to be responsible for that result in the only way that was actually available to her, by doing well with it, by being, as fully as she could manage, the person she was, whatever the circumstances of her becoming. Leto was quiet for a long time after this. Then he said that this was the clearest formulation of what he'd been trying to do for 3,500 years that he had ever heard. She had said in 3 sentences what he had been enacting across millennia. She had the advantage, he noted, of not having the prescience. She could not see the futures that branched from her choices, could not measure herself against the probability fields, could not second-guess the living with the knowing. She was operating on faith in the decency of her own effort, without the terrible luxury of foresight. He found himself for the first time in centuries slightly envious. Your eyes, if they are closed, are resting in a darkness that is not really dark. It is warm, and there is a faint awareness of your own body's light in it, the thermal glow of a living thing in a quiet room. You do not have to analyze that. You do not have to name it. Just let it be part of what is here, part of the texture of this particular moment as the night continues its patient work. There is a paradox at the center of Leto's long project that is worth inhabiting slowly, because it contains the most profound irony in his entire story. He was a prescient being. He could see, with varying degrees of clarity, the probable futures that branched from any given present moment. This gift was also his most fundamental limitation, because everything he could see was by definition connected to him. His prescience could find whatever was findable by a being of his kind, and that meant whatever he was breeding for he could not fully verify, because the trait he was trying to create was specifically the trait of being undetectable to a mind like his, Siona Atreides. The culmination of a genetic project Leto had been running with exquisite patience for 35 centuries. Not a single breeding line, but a complex distributed program of genetic selection, operating across dozens of generations of multiple Atreides lineages, guided by Leto's prescient awareness of which matings were producing progress toward the goal and which were not. He was breeding for a specific quality, the ability to exist in the prophetic blind spot, the ability to walk through the future sight of a prescient and leave no trail. This sounds simple, and it was not. The genetics of prescience, of the particular sensitivity to probability fields that manifested in beings like Paul and Leto, were not fully understood even by the Bene Gesserit, who had been working on them for 10,000 years. What Leto was doing was not selecting for the presence of a gene but for the absence of a signature, breeding people who would not show up on the map that a prescient was drawing, people who could not be seen, people who could not therefore be controlled by any future oracle who might attempt to do what Leto had done. Sit with that for a moment. He was building his own limitation into the species. The God Emperor, who ruled by virtue of his ability to see what others could not see, was deliberately creating people who could not be seen by anyone with his abilities, including possibly himself. He was engineering the conditions of his own obsolescence. He was guaranteeing that what came after him could not simply be another version of him, could not be another Leto governing another 3.5 millennia with the same oversight and the same control. The Golden Path required, in its final phase, that the person carrying it forward be invisible to the instruments that had enabled it. This is not a paradox he was unaware of. He had known it from the beginning. It was in fact the deepest confirmation that the plan was working. The moment he began to lose the ability to see clearly into the futures that Siona would inhabit, the moment her presence in his prescience became a genuine blind spot rather than a temporary gap, that was the moment he knew the breeding had succeeded. Siona Atreides, as an individual person, was not a simple or comfortable person. She was fierce and intelligent, and deeply, genuinely resentful of Leto in ways that were not strategic but personal. The accumulated resentment of an Atreides who had grown up in the shadow of a God Emperor, who was also family, who had known all her life that she was part of a project she had not consented to, whose autonomy and whose choices had been, in some sense that she could feel, even when she could not fully articulate it, pre-selected. She was right to be resentful. Leto would have agreed. Her resentment was not a failure of understanding. It was the correct response to her situation. He had made her, in a meaningful sense. Not her person, her personality, her intelligence, her specific quality of fierceness were her own, the product of her own experience and choices. But the genetic ground that made those qualities possible, the particular combination of capacities that made her the culmination of his program, that had been arranged. She had arrived into a story that had been written before she was born, and the part she was meant to play was the part that ended the author. The first time Leto realized he could not fully see Siona's future was, by his own account in the journals that survived him, one of the most quietly extraordinary moments of his long reign. He had been monitoring the probable futures that branched from her presence, as he monitored all important presences in his court, and the futures were there, sharp, accessible, traversable in the way that all futures were to him, and then gradually over a period of months they became slightly blurry at the edges, then less accessible, then genuinely opaque in a specific zone around her direct line of descent. He did not tell her. He watched it happen with the particular quality of satisfaction that comes when a thing you have worked toward for a very long time finally, quietly, arrives. 3,500 years of careful breeding, and here was its culmination. A young woman who was genuinely beyond his sight. Siona would ultimately be part of the conspiracy that ended him. This was not a surprise to him, even in the details that his prescience could no longer fully track. He had always known that the person who carried the trait he was breeding for would also be the type of person who would choose to act against him. The trait and the character were linked. The invisibility to prescience came with an independence, a specific quality of unconditioned autonomy that could not coexist with quiet acceptance of a God Emperor's authority. He had bred the person who would kill him. Or more precisely, he had bred the person who would set in motion the events that would lead to his death. And he had done so in the full knowledge that this was what he was doing. The golden path required that it end. An ending arranged by a being he could no longer fully see was the only ending that could not be mistaken for something else. It was, in the most literal sense, the first genuinely unscripted event of his entire reign. He left records. The journals that Siona would eventually access, stealing them from his most secured vaults, risking the full weight of his prescient awareness and his administrative power to retrieve them. Those journals contained, among other things, his complete account of what he had done and why. Not a justification in the defensive sense, not an apology, a genuine explanation offered to a future that he could not see clearly, from a being who had operated in perfect clarity for 35 centuries and had finally, deliberately, created the conditions for genuine surprise. The journals described the scattering. They described what he hoped it would become. They described the version of human future that he had worked toward with everything he had, and the version he feared would come instead, and the specific hope that the people who carried Siona's blood, the invisible people, the people no prescient eye could find, would be the ones who navigated between those futures. They described in the spare language of a being who had said everything there was to say across 3.5 millennia, what it had cost him to care this much about people he would never meet. The journals were written in multiple languages, not all of them human in origin. Some passages used a notation system that Leto had developed himself over the course of his reign, a hybrid of several Bene Gesserit internal communication systems and the particular shorthand that had evolved in his own thinking across 3.5 millennia of private reflection. Siona spent years working through them. She was not the only one. A small community of scholars, most of them connected to the Bene Gesserit in various ways, worked on the translations in the generations following his death, but she was the first, and she was the one who read the sections he had written directly to the future, without knowing who specifically would be reading them. He had addressed these sections to no one, not to Siona by name. He had known she would be the one to take them, in the broad strokes, but the precise future had been blurring by the end, and he had not known her specific features clearly enough to address her directly. He had written to the concept of the person who would come, whoever would arrive at these pages with enough courage to steal them, and enough capacity to understand what they contained. He assumed intelligence. He assumed on the evidence of the person's survival, to the point of being able to read the pages, a certain quality of resilience. He assumed nothing else. What he wrote to them was not an explanation in the defensive sense. He did not argue for himself. He described, with the same quality of honest precision that had characterized his public communications at their best, what he had seen when he looked at the probable futures, and what he had decided to do about it, and what he believed the cost had been and to whom. He did not resolve the moral question. He laid it out in full and left it. He trusted whoever was reading to hold it without requiring resolution, because resolution was not available, and the person who required resolution in order to function was not the person the future needed. The last section of the journals, written in a hand that was slightly less precise than the earlier sections, reflecting the physical deterioration of the final months before the bridge, contained something that the scholars debated for generations, a list of names, not of historical figures, not of his ancestors, not of the people who had served him, names in a variety of languages, from a variety of cultures that did not match any individual in the historical record. The best interpretation, the one that eventually achieved something like consensus, was that they were the names of people who existed in futures he had seen, people from the worlds of the scattering, people who had not yet been born at the time he wrote the list. He had seen them, dimly, in the blurring prescience of his final phase. He had written down their names. He had not explained why or what they were to do, or what the futures he had seen for them contained. Perhaps he had simply wanted them to be named, to be acknowledged, however briefly, by the consciousness that had arranged the conditions of their existence. Perhaps it was his version of the practice that the ancestor voices had given him, the practice of being genuinely present to the individual in the midst of the vast. They were not abstractions to him, these people he would never meet. They were, in whatever limited way a blurring prescience could make real, known to him. He had given them the only thing he had left to give. The world outside has gone entirely quiet now, or perhaps it has not. Perhaps the same sounds are there, the same texture of night, the same ordinary life of the world continuing its business just beyond your walls. But they have receded far enough that what you're in now is a different kind of space, a space that belongs to the hours of deep rest, where things can be known without effort and felt without urgency. Stay here, the story is almost complete, and the end is, like all true endings, also a beginning. The end of Leto II. Atreides came in the 3,500th year of his reign. Not as a dramatic military defeat. The idea of a military force capable of defeating him had not been a serious possibility for 3,000 years. Not as a political collapse. The administrative structure of his empire was, as he had maintained it, entirely intact. It came through water, through a bridge over the Idaho River, in the setting he had chosen for his final audience, with Siona and a Duncan Gholas and the Tleilaxu face dancer Nayla as the attending witnesses to the last act of his long performance. The circumstances were arranged, partly by his enemies, partly in ways they could not have fully known, by him. He fell into the river. The sandtrout membrane which had protected him from so much for so long could not survive the immersion. The creatures had evolved over millions of years to avoid exactly this. They dissolved. And without the membrane, without the accumulated spice saturation in the tissue, the worm body that Leto had occupied for 35 centuries could not sustain itself in anything resembling its previous form. He did not die quickly. He lay on the riverbank, and the last Duncan Idaho held him, and for the first time in 3,500 years, a human being was touching his skin. Not through the membrane, skin to skin. The ordinary, unremarkable miracle of direct human contact that most people experience dozens of times a day without pausing to consider it. He felt it. He felt it with the full weight of 35 centuries of not feeling it behind the moment, and whatever the experience was, whether it was grief or relief or something beyond both, it was the last ordinary human sensation he would have. He spoke in those final hours. He spoke to Siona, who had helped engineer his death, and who stood before him with the complicated mixture of triumph and something that was not quite remorse, but was its neighbour. He told her what the scattering was. He told her what he hoped it would produce. He told her about the people who would not be visible to any oracle, her descendants, and the descendants of those who carried her blood out into the spaces between stars, and what he hoped they would do with the freedom he had spent so long constructing at such enormous cost. As he died, the spice that had been concentrated in his body at levels that had not existed anywhere in the universe since the last old-style sandworm had been converted to the pre-worm cycle. That spice released, into the water, into the air, into the soil. A single death, releasing 3.5 millennia of accumulated chemical that had been locked inside a single body. The Arrakis ecology, which had been compressed and contained and managed for 35 centuries, received a pulse of the substance that governed its deepest processes. The sandworms, which had been suppressed during his reign, would return. The cycle would resume. The great Shai-Hulud would rise again from the transformed desert, and the spice would flow again, and the universe would enter a period that would be nothing like any period that had preceded it. And the scattering, The thing he had built everything toward. The people of the human-settled worlds, who had spent 3,500 years in Leto's carefully managed stillness, who had been building resentment and restlessness, and the specific form of hunger that comes from being safe for too long. Those people flooded outward. Not in an organized colonization program, not in the managed expansion of an empire with flags and protocols and reports back to central authority. Out, simply out, in every direction that a ship could travel into the void, into the territories that had never been surveyed, into the distances that no navigators had ever bothered to map because Leto's gravity had been so complete that there had been no reason to. They went so far and so fast and in so many different directions, simultaneously, that, within a generation, the human presence in the universe had expanded by an order of magnitude that no prescient being, however gifted, could track. They were everywhere. They were nowhere specific. They were beyond the reach of any oracle who might someday arise and try to do what Leto had done. Gather them, contain them, hold them in the one warm basin that could be targeted and ended. They could not be gathered. They were the scattering. They were the point. What Leto left behind, besides the people and the worlds and the spice cycle and the fish speakers dispersing into the population, what he left in the record, in the journals that Siona had carried out of his vaults, was a philosophy of love that looks, from certain angles, like cruelty. The belief that the most loving thing you can do for a species that has become too comfortable is to make it uncomfortable. The belief that the most protective thing you can do for a people that has learned to depend on you is to take yourself away. The belief that the parent who never lets the child fall has not actually protected the child from falling, only deferred it, and ensured that when the fall comes there will be no experience to draw on. He loved humanity. He loved it with the full weight of every ancestor voice, every emotional register, every accumulated experience of joy and grief that 10,000 years of human living had deposited in his cells. And he expressed that love by building the hardest thing love can build, the conditions for genuine freedom, not the freedom of having no constraints. The freedom of being beyond the reach of any oracle, any tyrant, any god. The freedom of the genuinely unknown future. Let that settle now. Let it go the way you let a breath go, not released with effort, just allowed to leave when it's ready. The story of Leto II Atreides is the story of a being who saw the longest view that has ever been seen in any imagined human future, and chose to spend his one existence, however long and strange and costly, in service of it. He is not a comfortable figure. He was not meant to be. He was meant to make you feel the weight of time, the weight of choice, the weight of what it costs to care about people you will never meet, in futures you will never see, making decisions you will never know the outcome of. You're already in the beginning of sleep. You may not notice it yet. The mind keeps talking, even as the body settles, keeps narrating, even as the images begin to blur at the edges. That is fine. Let it talk. The talking will slow on its own. The desert that Leto walked is very far from here, in time and in space, and in the particular quality of reality that fiction occupies. And yet the question it asks is not far at all. How long are you willing to tend to something, if what you are tending is important enough? The room around you is exactly as it was. Nothing has changed, and everything is slightly different in the way that things become slightly different, when you have spent time with a large idea, and the idea has done its quiet work in you. You do not have to hold any of this. The story will be here if you want to return to it. The ideas will settle in the way that sediment settles, in the dark, without your attention. Breathe in, breathe out. The night is patient. Arrakis is a long way away. The sandworms are turning in their ancient rhythms, the spice is rising through the soil, and somewhere in the scattered dark between the stars, the descendants of Siona Atreides are moving in directions that no prescient eye can follow. They are free. They are beyond the reach of the golden cage and the golden path and the god who loved them enough to spend everything he had on their release. You are warm. You are held. Let the darkness come. It is not the darkness of the desert. It is the darkness of the room you are in, the room that is yours, the room that will still be here when you wake. Let yourself go into it the way you go into any passage that you trust. Slowly, without resistance, one breath at a time. Sleep well. If you like this video, let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always curious about that. and if you have a suggested topic, feel free to leave it in the comments. In the years immediately following his death, there was a period that historians would later call the famine times, not because food was absent, but because the spice was. The concentrated reserves that had been managed and distributed under Leto's administration did not last indefinitely, and the spice cycle, disrupted by 35 centuries of suppressed sandworm activity, did not recover immediately. The guild navigators who depended on spice for the prescient ability to fold space safely were suddenly operating at diminished capacity. Interstellar travel became more dangerous. Some routes were abandoned. The human worlds, which had been connected by Leto's efficient administration for 35 centuries, began to feel the friction of that connectivity being reduced. It was exactly what he had predicted. It was exactly what he had needed to happen. Because the scattering was not a rational decision that people made after careful analysis. It was driven in its early phase by the specific urgency of a people who suddenly understood, in their bodies and not just their minds, that the safety they had taken for granted was contingent, that it had been held in place by a single being whose departure had exposed the fragility beneath. The famine of connection, the sudden awareness of distance and risk was the final push, the one that moved the restlessness from cultural background noise to existential imperative. The people who scattered were not the adventurers, not primarily. They were the ordinary people, the farmers and administrators and teachers and engineers, the people who had been living their safe, arranged, slightly suffocating lives in Leto's empire and who, when the arrangement stopped holding, found in themselves a quality of willingness they had not known they possessed. The capacity to go into the unknown and build something new from whatever they found there. It was always in them. The museum had not removed it. It had only kept it from being exercised. And the thing about a capacity that has been kept from exercise for a very long time is that when it is finally given permission, it moves with a force that surprises even the person possessing it. The scattering seeded the universe with human communities so diverse in their formation, their values, their technologies, their philosophies, their very genetic expression, because isolation and environmental pressure began their work immediately, that within a few generations the human-inhabited universe had become genuinely ungovernable by any central authority. Not through warfare or resistance, but simply through the irreducible complexity of a species that had finally been allowed to become as various as it was capable of being. Some of what they built was beautiful. Some was terrible. All of it was alive in a way that Leto's long, careful stasis had not been. All of it was producing the genuine surprises, the real errors and real discoveries, the wild improbability of genuine freedom, that he had spent everything he had to make possible. The sandworms that returned to Arrakis in the generations following Leto's death were not immediately the great creatures of the pre-Leto era. The ecological succession was slow. The moisture-trapping work of the sandtrout had to re-establish itself. The spice cycle had to rebuild its deep rhythms. The desert had to reclaim the margins that 3.5 centuries of terraforming had softened. But they came. The first recorded sighting of a worm of significant size in the 80th year after his death was observed by a Fremen community in the deep desert who had maintained more of the old practices than most, and who received the sighting with a quality of feeling that none of them could find the right words for. Gratitude was part of it, the sense of a return, the sense that something very large that had been held still for a very long time had finally been given permission to move. The spice that the returning worms produced was not pharmacologically identical to the spice of the old era. It had been altered, subtly but measurably, by 3.5 millennia of concentrated storage in Leto's body. The specific molecular signature had evolved in ways that the biochemists of the post-Leto era spent generations studying. Some of the navigators of the reconstituting guild found that the new spice produced cleaner prescient visions, less noise in the probability fields, a higher ratio of reliable signal. Others found it produced visions that were harder to interpret, stranger in their symbolic register, less connected to the human frameworks through which prescient information had previously been translated. The new spice was operating in a universe that contained now the genetic change Siona carried. It was operating in a universe that was already beginning to become harder to see. Whether the spice was responding to that change or simply reflecting, it was a question that could not be definitively answered. Both possibilities seemed, to those who thought carefully about it, equally fitting. In the outer reaches of the scattering, the communities that had gone furthest, that had been out of contact with the known human worlds long enough to have genuinely diverged, the memory of Leto II Atreides became legend in the specific form that all very large things become legend when they are far enough away, compressed, distorted toward the archetypal, stripped of the specific texture that gave the original its complexity. In some communities he became a devil figure, the imprisoner, the god who had held them still. In others he became a saint, the sacrifice, the being who had given everything for a future he would never see. In a few he became neither, became instead a problem, a case study, a thing to think with. The communities that made him a problem to think with produced, according to the scattered historical records that survive, the most interesting political philosophy of the post-scattering era, which may have been, in some way he could not have seen clearly in his blurring final prescience, exactly what he had hoped,